Welcome back to the Dictator's Playbook. In the last episode, we examined the conditions through which authoritarian leaders, specifically Castro, Stalin, and Mao, were able to rise to power. We learned that while they were leaders of different states, many parallels existed between them, and each country we studied had similar conditions that led to the establishment of an authoritarian state in that nature. Now we know what conditions were present that allowed them to come to power. We must examine the methods with which they were able to maintain it. How were these leaders able to consistently maintain power despite decades of opposition? Join us as we dive into that question and learn about what made them so brittle. The first process through which authoritarian leaders were able to come to power that we will examine today is the use of legal methods. Castro, Stalin, and Mao were able to take advantage of legal methods, using them to control the population and establish and solidify their own rule. The ways in which they did this were more similar than different. As he was working to take power, Castro issued a series of proclamations. These decrees included appeals for a general strike by the population and even death threats directed against candidates running for public office. Additionally, Castro threatened voters to keep them from showing up to polling places, and he refused to deal with junta that had been in place. However, despite these actions, Castro did not rely much on legal methods and focused more on the use of force. In the USSR, Lenin set up a secret police force, known as the NKVD, to control and place fear in the general population, and created a system of prison camps. He also used show trials to convict political dissidents, and he tried engineers to sabotaging production solely to increase the general level of fear in the country, leading to an overall state of surrender. Lenin and Stalin were also intent on using legal methods to implement economic policies, as Stalin enacted centralized economic planning and legislation that prohibited peasants from selling their products at market stalls. Additionally, the USSR controlled the contact that foreigners had with citizens and vice versa, as Russians who came into contact with the West during World War I were treated as possible traitors. Russians could not travel abroad, and very few foreigners were allowed to visit the USSR. Lenin and Stalin made extensive use of legal methods to maintain and consolidate power, as they allowed them to carry out their policies of oppression. In China, Mao used legal methods primarily to remove opposition within the government. He used the Cultural Revolution to remove party officials whom he believed were deviating from the party's socialist ideals, and his party, the CCP, clamped down on Red Guards. As in Russia, Mao's government had control over economic issues and the movement of citizens within the country. The state initially used legal means to take ownership over heavy industry and the banking system. The CCP was more effective at taxing the citizens than the GMD had been, and Chinese citizens had to obtain residence certificates and permission to move their residence or work. As in the USSR primarily, as well as Cuba, legal methods were used in China to take power and oppress the average population in the country. Most certainly, the primary method with which authoritarian power is consolidated and maintained in any nation is through the use of force. Physical violence and the threat of it potentially occurring is an extremely useful motivating factor, as no person wants to face painful physical pain and death is the ultimate punishment, one from which no one can recover. The gravity of this method, however, does not stop it from being frequently used as a tactic to coerce the population, and dictators used force liberally to strengthen their grip on power. Castro used force constantly throughout his rule to control the island's population. During Castro's rule, thousands of Cubans were incarcerated in abysmal prisons, thousands more were harassed and intimidated. His security forces were responsible for beatings and arbitrary detention, and solitary confinement was used frequently within prisons. The entire system with which the government operated was based on human rights abuses, and labor camps and executions were a mainstay in the country as well. Executions were commonplace in the USSR, and they were ultimately responsible for a decline in the revolutionary movement. In fact, one of the trademarks of the USSR is terrors, where masses of average citizens were rounded up and executed. There were about 353,000 executions in 1937, and over 328,000 executions in 1938. The NKVD was primarily responsible for these death counts, but has faced violence within the organization itself, as 23,000 NKVD agents were executed after the purge slowdown. In addition to executions, the Gulag, an infamous prison camp, held millions of citizens. As in Cuba, the Russian leadership cracked down on anything that could even potentially be perceived as going against the goals of the state, and force was used to keep the average population in line. Continuing with the theme in the other nations, extensive executions were commonplace in China, and in total, over 700,000 people with GMD links were executed. Additionally, the prison camp system in China was expanded as well. Ultimately, the purges and violence went farther than even Mao himself had intended, and violent clashes were known to have developed between Red Guards and workers and students. And to think, the forceful acts listed here only touch the surface of the violence that occurred in China under Mao. Truly, the use of force is the most important method for the maintenance of power in all authoritarian states, because it keeps the peasants in line and serves as a roadblock to any attempts to rebellion. One interesting method through which power is maintained and consolidated is charismatic leadership. This particular aspect is rarely discussed, largely because authoritarian leaders do not display many charismatic traits and are generally seen as being only cold-hearted individuals. While this fact is certainly true, occasionally some leaders would display a sense of charisma, only to further coerce the population into supporting them. By portraying themselves as charismatic, dictators suggested to the average citizen that they were ultimately in control, that they had a say in the way in which the government was run, and that it would be dangerous to attempt to remove the leader because a harsh dictator could replace them. However, to an even greater extent than the previous methods which have been discussed, charismatic leadership was not a tactic to maintain power that was utilized by all leaders, as some can only be considered cruel, and they did not see charisma as beneficial to their success. At the start of the revolution, Castro was described as the heaven-sent savior of the nation, and one Presbyterian minister even described him by saying, "It is my conviction with full responsibility for what I am saying, that Fidel Castro is an instrument in the hands of God for the establishment of his reign among men." These bold religious statements solidified his position among the God-fearing population in the country, and as a result, the problems associated with Castro's rule were not fully realized until it was too late. Castro was, at least initially, seen as a benevolent ruler who had the best intentions at heart and would free the peasants from the system of oppression which they had suffered under for many years, and citizens had even been documented to have compared him to Jesus Christ. These sweeping compliments made it even harder for Castro's rule to be resisted, and resulted in a general unwillingness to do so at the critical moments when his rise to power could still be controlled. Unlike Castro, Stalin made absolutely no attempts at being a charismatic leader. He made no effort to appeal as benevolent and willing to help the people, and instead he solely relied on force and an attitude to solidify his rule. While evil, his method certainly worked, and Stalin was able to exercise broad control without concern over how the citizens might feel about him. Much more similar to Castro, Mao attempted to portray a charismatic persona, but he did so conservatively and only when absolutely necessary. Undoubtedly, the biggest indicator of Mao realizing the importance of displaying a charismatic personality was the 100 Flowers campaign. During the event, intellectuals were encouraged to speak up about what they felt was wrong with the country and the system of government. While it took persistent urging, as initially the intellectuals were concerned with the possibility of facing retribution, eventually they felt that it would be okay to speak out. When this began to occur, Mao quickly removed his charismatic persona, ending the campaign, and punished some of the intellectuals that shared their opinions. While it is somewhat strange that an authoritarian dictator would create events such as the 100 Flowers campaign, the evident reason is that he used it to present himself as being willing to listen to ideas and to give the intellectuals an outlet to present their grievances to avoid a revolution. In the last episode, we discussed propaganda and the role it played in the creation and emergence of authoritarian states. Dictators used it to present themselves as strong and capable of running a productive and stable nation. Additionally, by showing their strength, propaganda was used to suggest that it was pointless to try and resist the influence of the leadership, because ultimately those who resisted would face severe punishment. Propaganda was used in a similar way to maintain and consolidate the power that dictators already had and to prevent the outbreak of a revolution. Propaganda in Cuba largely consisted of posters and billboards depicting Castro as a strong, fierce leader. Cuban flags were commonly included to instill a sense of patriotism and nationalism, and images of soldiers together with guns raised was intended to portray a common goal of uniting against external and internal threats towards the nation. Additionally, as mentioned in the previous episode, Castro's revolutionary group, the M267, had its own newspapers and radio stations to further allow his strength and influence to proudly be projected across the island. As in Cuba, in any state with an authoritarian government, Stalin used propaganda extensively to develop a cult of personality around him and create a belief that he was sacred. Stalin appeared in posters, statues, and paintings throughout the USSR, and he was said to be a father figure. Stalin's status was glorified through writing as well. The Communist Party's official party newspaper emphasized his importance. History was rewritten to glorify his role in the country and to suggest that he was stronger than in reality, and a short biography about him was published on his 60th birthday. As with Castro, everything that Stalin did with propaganda was designed to create and strengthen a cult of personality around him. Perhaps the most interesting way that he did this was by building a cult of personality around Lenin after his death, and then portraying himself as having been closest to him in order to increase his own standing. Though the peasants in the country knew the reality of the situation they were in, Stalin still worked hard to demonstrate that he was a strong and powerful leader. As with Castro and eventually Stalin, Mao worked to create a personality cult around him to solidify his reputation and power. Writings depicted Mao in a positive light were published, and paintings and statues were erected. Even when a play was written criticizing Mao's decisions and overall leadership, the Shanghai Forum staged a campaign against it. A resolution was passed praising Mao, and to show off his personal strength, Mao organized and completed a rigorous Great Swim across the Yangtze River. As with the other leaders, he did not only use propaganda, however, to boost his own image. He also used it to demonstrate the strength of the state and to attack Western and traditional Chinese values in an attempt to only have support for the Communist Party's policies. When considering the methods with which a dictator in an authoritarian state maintained and consolidated power, it can be helpful to analyze how opposition in that state was treated. In a nation such as Cuba, the USSR, and China during these time periods, citizens were prohibited from speaking out against injustices and punished for attempting to do so. While opposition was treated harshly in all of the countries we have studied, we can still make some distinctions between them. As discussed previously when we talked about the use of force, Castro often subjected individuals that posed opposition to labor camps and executions. One source of opposition for him were human rights defenders, journalists, trade unionists, and other critics of the government. In 2003, Castro cracked down on this group of people and accused them of being mercenaries of the United States government. Many of these informers served years in inhumane prisons where they were subjected to extended solitary confinement and beatings and denied basic medical care for serious ailments. Many of these prisoners were released 5 years later when Fidel Castro handed over power to his brother, Raul, if they agreed to be exiled to Spain. Additionally, opposition for Castro came in the form of human rights organizations, alternative political parties, independent labor unions, or free press. All these groups are denied the opportunity to work in Cuba. One significant source of opposition for Stalin came in the form of members of the Communist Party who were considered to be not communist enough, or only there for personal gain. Stalin had them purged, or expelled, for the party, even through mass reform campaigns where 20% of the commission was expelled from the party. Stalin also used the voting system to solidify his power, and the way he treated opposition can be seen when Sergei Kirov won more votes than Stalin in an election to the party's Central Committee. Stalin had Kirov's votes destroyed to make it appear as though he had won, and Kirov was eventually murdered. Additionally, Stalin attacked leading members of the armed forces as they posed the biggest threat due to the fact that they had a means to fight back. Stalin's regime arrested 35,000 army officers between 1937 and 1938, and he removed almost half of the Red Army's senior officials. While he had managed to secure his monopoly in power, Stalin was concerned about his ability to maintain it, and so he armed anyone who stood in his way with whatever means necessary. Arguably, the strongest form of opposition that Mao faced as dictator was the concept of Western-style democracy, a form of government where citizens were free to voice their opinions and elections occurred. As with Stalin, Mao purged non-communist officials from the Communist Party and mobilized the Chinese population at large to identify spies and traitors. Mao also made extensive use of labor reform, with over 500,000 people going through the process and executions. This can clearly be seen through the 500,000 people, most of them intellectuals, who died. Intellectuals were a source of opposition that Mao focused on, as they had the ability to understand how a democratic society would work, the flaws with the government in China, and what must be done to establish a just society. To counteract these harmful abilities that they had, Mao mobilized the Red Guards to launch violent attacks on intellectuals. As various threats popped up during his rule, Mao was quick to neutralize all of them to avoid a situation where he was forced out of power. Finally, the last issue, which must be examined to learn how leaders in authoritarian states maintain power, is that of foreign affairs. Generally, authoritarian states had a few close-knit allies, but they faced opposition from democratic countries that were concerned by human rights violations within them and the potential effects throughout the rest of the world. This can clearly be seen through the relationships that Cuba, the USSR, and China had with foreign states. Throughout Castro's rule, the United States remained the biggest threat to the longevity of the state and his regime. The U.S. government had maintained their condemnation of the human rights situation in Cuba, and is even responsible for multiple attempts at removing Castro from power. It is said that the CIA planned over 600 plots and conspiracies with the goal of assassinating Castro, though they were ultimately unable to do so. One of the most famous of those was the Bay of Pigs invasion. For the invasion, multiple groups of American troops were trained to invade Cuba from both the air and the sea, but it failed immediately. The troops were captured and held prisoner for 20 months until the United States negotiated a deal with Castro to free them. While, through events such as the Bay of Pigs invasion, the United States represented significant opposition, Cuba's biggest ally was the Soviet Union. The USSR purchased large amounts of sugar from Cuba, therefore building up Cuba's economy through the purchase of its main cash crop. Additionally, the Soviets exported machinery and equipment, fuel, mineral raw materials, metals, and food products to Cuba. Importantly, Cuba and the USSR were also committed to allying from a military standpoint. As with Cuba, the USSR's biggest foreign obstacle proved to be the United States. As communism was the complete opposite of America's belief in democratic government, this created a strong rift between the two nations, which resulted in a Cold War where military dominance was emphasized in case an outbreak of fighting occurred. However, the USSR faced other foreign aggression, and prior to World War II, they were threatened by both the rise of Nazi Germany and Japanese expansionism. The weak status of the Red Army encouraged an invasion by Hitler, and Stalin's diplomacy was unable to fight off that invasion. The Red Army experienced a military failure of its own when it attempted to invade Poland and was forced to retreat, resulting in humiliation for the Bolsheviks. The USSR failed even in the ring of foreign diplomacy, as the nation remained diplomatically isolated and was not invited to join the League of Nations in 1920. However, the USSR did have some success in regards to foreign relations. The Soviet regime was eventually able to withstand the Nazi assault and liberate the country of Nazi forces by 1944, and they were able to install communist puppet governments in Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer zone from the West. Additionally, the USSR experienced increased growth as far as foreign relations were concerned, as it was recognized by Great Britain and the U.S. and allowed to join the League of Nations in 1934. Additionally, the USSR signed the Treaty of Rapallo, which restored normal diplomatic relations with Germany, a pact with France and Czechoslovakia which committed them to defending the latter against attack, and a non-aggression pact with Japan. As with Cuba and the USSR, China found themselves becoming increasingly isolated internationally, and even the country's relations with the Soviet Union restrained. Mao received little direct aid from the USSR. Stalin urged Mao to be content with just control of northern China, and the USSR refused to help China develop an atomic bomb. Additionally, China's relationship with the U.S. remained rough. The U.S. had initially helped the GMD, but it stopped support once they realized how corrupt the party had become. This quickly became a moot point, however, as the CCP took control over mainland China. The United States refused to recognize the People's Republic of China until 1974, and it blocked the PRC's admission to the United Nations until 1971, and it even signed a defense treaty with Taiwan when it was threatened by Mao's regime. As with Cuba and the USSR, this is not to say, however, that the People's Republic of China had no diplomatic successes. The government saved communist North Korea from collapse, was eventually able to restore relations with the U.S., and Mao even signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union. Even the USSR temporarily boycotted the UN in protest of China's exclusion. In addition to all of this, Mao experienced success in spreading communism around the globe, as he provided military supplies to North Vietnam, who eventually took over the whole country, and established strong links with third world countries to promote communism there. In this episode, we have examined the methods through which communist leaders were able to consolidate and maintain their power. Through a variety of legal methods, the use of force, poor treatment of opposition, In attempts at establishing positive foreign relations, Castro, Stalin, and Mao were able to establish and hold on to their power for a very long time. In the next episode, we will be examining the policies that they established while in office and the aims and results of these policies.